The colonel's hand, wrinkled and steady, reached for the ornate fountain pen. The air in the room was thick with the silence of ceremony, a quiet broken only by the low hum of diplomacy. From my position against the wall, I saw what no one else did, a subtle flaw. In the pen's casing, a faint chemical scent, a story of imminent violence. I moved, not with panic but with purpose. My voice was calm, cutting through the stillness, and I spoke in the flawless Spanish I knew he'd understand from his time in Bogotá. No firm, I said softly. Esa pluma es una arma. Don't sign. That pen is a weapon. His hand stopped, hovering over the polished mahogany, and a tremor ran through it. His eyes, sharp, intelligent, and moments ago dismissive, snapped up to meet mine. The condescension was gone, replaced by a flash of dawning, horrified comprehension. He saw me, truly saw me, for the first time. His voice was a choked whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 classified reports. Keystone? The name, my name, hung in the air like a ghost. The pen fell from his numb fingers with a sharp clatter that echoed like a gunshot. A heartbeat later, the doors crashed open, and my husband's SEAL team swept in, a wave of controlled chaos that secured the room in seconds. I watched my father's smug, proud expression melt away, leaving behind the slack-jawed face of a man whose entire world had just been dismantled. An hour earlier, that same expression had been firmly in place. We were in the VIP reception area at the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, a room full of dress uniforms and forced smiles. I stood beside my husband, Lieutenant Commander Mark Jensen, a decorated SEAL who wore his heroism with quiet confidence. Holding court with the guest of honor, Colonel Davies, was my father, Richard, a man who worshipped the authority he'd never earned himself. He gestured proudly at Mark, soaking in the reflected glory, before waving a dismissive hand in my direction. And of course you know my daughter, he laughed, a booming, artificial sound designed to impress. She's just a secretary here on base. Does a great job keeping the paperwork moving for the real heroes, Colonel? The polite, shallow chuckles from the surrounding officers felt like tiny needles. It was a familiar sting, the same dismissal I'd felt 100 times over dinner tables and holidays. But here it was different. It wasn't just an insult, it was a dangerous miscalculation. Colonel Davies gave me a placating, condescending smile before turning away, marking me as irrelevant. The physical blow of the disrespect was sharp, but the professional analyst in me felt a colder, more urgent alarm. In a room with a potential threat, my father had just made me invisible. He'd just told everyone that the one person tasked with their safety was nobody at all. He chuckled, thinking it was just another harmless jab at my boring desk job. He had no idea he'd just painted a target on his own back by trivializing my presence in front of the very man whose life I was here to protect. To understand the reckoning that followed, you have to understand the two lives I was living. My father's world was built on clear, simple lines of authority. There were heroes, and then there was everyone else who supported them. To him, my husband Mark was a hero. His job was tangible, dangerous, and photogenic in a dress uniform. My job, on the other hand, was abstract. It was paperwork. This narrative was never clearer than at a family dinner a few months before the treaty signing. The conversation was its usual mix of neighborhood gossip and my father's opinions. On world events, when Mark's phone buzzed with a specific, urgent tone, the entire table fell silent. He looked at the screen, his expression hardening into professional focus, and simply said, "I have to go." Instantly, the energy in the room shifted. My mother began fussing over him. My father stood up and clapped him on the shoulder, his chest puffed out with pride. "Go get the bad guys, son," he said, his voice thick with performative gravity. It was a scene straight out of a movie, the noble warrior heading off to battle. A few minutes after Mark left, my own encrypted phone vibrated with a silent, insistent pulse against my hip. I glanced down at the single red banner flashing on the screen. A high-priority alert? A threat matrix had just changed. I folded my napkin and stood up. "Sorry," I said quietly to the room. "I have to go in too." My father just sighed, a heavy theatrical sound of pure disappointment. He didn't even look at me, just stared at my empty chair. "They can't find another secretary to work the weekend shift? Honestly, Anna?" The words landed without any real heat, just the cold, tired weight of expectation. An inconvenience. His son-in-law's departure was a sacrifice for the nation. My departure was a failure of office management. The disparity was a familiar chasm that had been widening my entire life. I didn't see the car he'd co-signed for my brother, or the tuition he'd paid for my sister. I saw every time my own ambitions were patted on the head and dismissed as a nice little hobby. It was just the way things were. My other world, my real world, was a place my father couldn't even imagine. It was a sensitive compartmented information facility, or SCIF, a silent, windowless vault of steel and concrete, shielded from any and all electronic eavesdropping. Here, there were no family dynamics, no golden children, no secretaries. There was only the mission. Here, I wasn't Anna. I was Keystone, the lead intelligence analyst for a joint special operations task force. My authority wasn't inherited or assumed, it was earned with every correct assessment, with every life saved by the data I provided. My team didn't see a secretary, they saw the person who built the maps they used to navigate the darkness. I remember standing in the cold, sterile air of the briefing room, the only light coming from the massive screen behind me. It was covered in satellite imagery, signals intelligence data, and complex timelines. On a secure monitor, I could see the faces of the operators I was briefing. Hard, focused men, my husband among them. He wasn't the hero here, he was an asset, a listener, waiting for his intelligence lead to give him the go-ahead. I pointed a laser at a blinking red dot on the map. "We've flagged a high-value target entering the AO for Operation Serpent's Tooth," I said, my voice calm and even. His pattern of life analysis shows a preference for symbolic dates, which is why the treaty signing is a prime window. We believe he'll use a deniable asset to deploy a chemical aerosol device. There were no sighs of disappointment here. There was only focused intensity. These men, these elite warriors my father idolized, looked to me for the truth. In this room, I was the brain, and they were the spear. I translated the whispers and shadows of the world into actionable intelligence. I told them where to go, what to look for, and who to trust. It was a responsibility that felt like a physical weight, a constant pressure in the back of my mind. But it was a world where I made sense. It was a world where I had a name, and that name was respected. A world where my contributions were not just seen, but were critical to survival. After that family dinner, my mother Carol, a woman who believed family peace was worth any price, followed me out to my car. She had that pained, placating look on her face she always wore when she was about to ask me to shrink myself for someone else's comfort. "Honey, you know how your father is," she whispered, as if he were a force of nature that couldn't be reasoned with. "He's from a different generation. He just sees Mark's uniform and the danger is so obvious. Your government job is safe. He's just proud his son-in-law is a hero and he's relieved you're not in harm's way." I just nodded. What could I say? How could I explain that my safe government job involved tracking assassins and preventing terror attacks? How could I tell her that the reason Mark was safe on his missions was because I had already identified the threats waiting for him? I realized then that their view of me wasn't just simple ignorance. It was a carefully constructed narrative they needed to believe. They needed me to be the secretary, the safe one, the footnote in the family story. My success, my reality, it was too complicated. It didn't fit into their simple lines of authority. My competence was an inconvenience to their worldview. They saw his uniform as a symbol of strength and my blazer as a symbol of service. For years, I let them believe it. But a threat assessment is a threat assessment, whether it's on a battlefield or in a reception hall. And I was about to run the final protocol. Back at the reception, the echo of my father's words, "just a secretary," hung in the air, a familiar dull ache. But something was different this time. The emotional sting was there, a flicker of heat, but it was instantly extinguished by the cold wave of my training. The hurt didn't vanish, it sublimated. It sharpened into a diamond-hard focus that cut through the noise of the room. I was no longer a daughter feeling slighted. I was an analyst on a live threat assessment, and the room was no longer a party, it was a grid of vectors and probabilities. My eyes swept the crowd, automatically discarding the knowns and searching for the anomalies. And then I saw him, the foreign dignitary's aide, the one man whose background check had come back suspiciously thin, a ghost in the system. He was trying to look calm, but his hand kept going to his tie, a nervous, repetitive gesture that screamed insecurity. Then my gaze dropped to the ornate pen case he was clutching a little too tightly. Every instinct, every hour spent analyzing surveillance footage of bombers and assassins, screamed at me. A deep, cold certainty settled in my gut. This wasn't just about neutralizing a threat anymore. This was about a public, undeniable correction of the record, a demonstration of value that could not be dismissed. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. A shouted warning would cause chaos, giving the assassin an opening and putting dozens of lives at risk. My response had to be surgical, a move played by the rules of my world, not his. My strategy formed in a matter of seconds. First, I shifted my position, moving gracefully through the crowd until I was in Colonel Davies's direct line of sight. Second, I chose my communication channel, Spanish, a language I knew he spoke fluently from. His years as a military attaché in Bogotá, a secure line the aide was unlikely to monitor. The final piece was already in place. Contingency Alpha, a non-verbal signal I'd briefed to Mark's SEAL team for just this type of scenario. My husband was my key ally. He stood across the room, seemingly at ease but perfectly positioned, a guardian pretending to be a guest. He wasn't just my husband, he was my operational partner, and he trusted my instincts implicitly. I caught his eye, a fleeting connection in the crowded room, and subtly tapped my temple. It was our signal. Go hot. He responded with a single, slow blink, an almost imperceptible confirmation. The switch had been flipped. His team was now on a hair trigger, their movements unseen but ready, waiting for my final command. The polished mahogany table where the treaty would be signed was no longer a symbol of peace. It was a stage. My father saw a party. I saw a kill box. The invitations had been sent, the guests had arrived. They had no idea they were about to witness a change of command they would never forget. The formal hall was a sea of dress uniforms and starched protocol. Towering flags stood like silent sentinels on the stage, and the air was thick with the weight of history and expectation. My family was seated in the front row, a place of honor secured by my husband's rank, and my father looked entirely at home. He sat with his shoulders back, his expression radiating a smug, borrowed importance. He was a guest at the table of power, and he was loving every second of it. At one point, he caught my eye from across the room where I stood by the wall. He gave me a tiny, condescending smile and made a small circular gesture with his hand. The universal sign for, go get some coffee. I gave him nothing back. No nod, no pained smile, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. In that moment, the last thread of filial obligation severed. I wasn't his daughter, Anna, the disappointing secretary. I was Keystone, the senior analyst for this operation, and every person in this room was my responsibility. I ignored his gesture and turned my full attention to the stage. The emotional noise was gone. There was only the cold, clear signal of the mission. My world had contracted to this single room, this single threat. The time for quiet observation was over. The time for action was here. The dignitaries took their seats at the heavy mahogany table. A respectful hush fell over the audience as the aide, the ghost we couldn't track, stepped forward. He moved with a practiced ceremonial grace, opening an ornate box and placing the fountain pen perfectly in the center of the treaty document. It gleamed under the stage lights, a symbol of peace and cooperation that I knew was a lie. As Colonel Davies leaned forward, his hand reaching out to seal the historic agreement, I took 2 deliberate steps away from the wall. My movement was small, but it was enough to draw his eye. My voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was perfectly clear, and it cut through the silence like a scalpel. Saint Coronel, no ferme. Esa pluma es una arma. A ripple of confusion went through the front rows. Heads turned. My father shot me a look of furious embarrassment. But the colonel didn't hear the crowd. He only heard me. He froze, his hand hovering inches from the pen, his entire body rigid. His eyes, which had glazed over me with polite disinterest an hour before, were now locked onto mine with searing intensity. I could almost see the tumblers clicking into place behind them. He had spent years in South America. He'd read dozens, if not hundreds, of my own intelligence briefs, classified assessments, on emerging threats from an analyst known only by a single enigmatic call sign. An analyst whose specialty was sophisticated, high-tech assassination devices. Just like this one. The quiet warning, the specific language, the unwavering confidence in my stance, it all coalesced in his mind into a single, terrifying truth. He leaned back slowly from the table, the color draining from his face. He looked straight at me, past the flags, past the generals, past my own stunned family. And he spoke the word that shattered their entire reality. Keystone? The name hung in the air, an impossible question loaded with authority. My father's jaw dropped. His face, a moment ago tight with anger at my interruption, was now a mask of utter bewilderment. His brain was visibly short-circuiting, trying to reconcile the image of his secretary, daughter with the name the colonel had just spoken with such reverence. He looked from the decorated, high-ranking officer to me and back again, his worldview crumbling in real time. In that split second of stunned silence, my husband Mark, hearing the call, sign, the execute order, spoke 3 urgent words into his wrist comm. Storm, storm, storm. The main doors didn't open, they exploded inward. The SEAL team moved with a terrifying fluid speed, a blur of black gear and focused intent. They created a human wall around the dignitaries while 2 of them slammed the assassin to the floor before he could even react. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath as fear and awe paralyzed them. An EOD specialist in a heavy blast suit moved methodically toward the table, his movements calm and precise as he carefully secured the pen in a gleaming silver containment box. The entire event, from breach to containment, took less than 10 seconds. The room was frozen, and in the center of it all stood my father, staring at me, his face a canvas of dawning, gut-wrenching shame. He was a guest in my world, and he had just been publicly revealed as the most ignorant person in the room. He saw Mark look right past him, ignoring his father-in-law completely, his eyes locked on me, waiting for my signal that the threat was clear. My father had spent my entire life teaching me to respect the uniform. But in that moment, he finally learned that the most dangerous weapon in the room wasn't the bomb in the pen, it was the mind he'd never bothered to know. In the secured anteroom, the adrenaline of the moment gave way to a cold, clinical reality. Minutes felt like hours. The EOD specialist worked under a bright, portable lamp, his movements a masterclass in precision. He carefully disassembled the fountain pen, laying out its intricate guts on a black cloth. We all watched as he exposed the core, a complex micro-bomb, no bigger than a grain of rice, wired to a tiny pressurized vial of a potent chemical agent. It was a perfect assassination device, elegant, deniable, and absolutely lethal. The air in the room grew heavy with the silent acknowledgement of the catastrophe that had been averted. The proof of the threat was undeniable, laid bare for all to see. Generals and admirals spoke in hushed, serious tones, but Colonel Davies bypassed them all. He walked directly to me, his face etched with a profound, weary respect. He took my hand, his grip firm and steady. "Your intel saved us all, Keystone," he said, his voice low and for my ears only. "It's an honor to finally meet the Ghost." The Ghost, the name they gave the unseen analyst whose reports they all relied on. For the first time, the Ghost had a face. From across the room, I saw my father take a hesitant step forward, his mouth opening to stammer my name, his face a mess of confusion and shame. Before he could speak, Mark was there, placing a quiet but immovable arm on his shoulder and giving a slight shake of his head. The message was unmistakable. "You don't get to talk to her right now." The circle had closed and he was on the outside. I was surrounded by my true peers, and in their eyes I saw not just awe but a deep and abiding respect. 6 months later, I stood on a stage once again. But this time, I wasn't a ghost standing against the wall. I was the guest of honor. I was wearing my own uniform, the dark blue civilian equivalent for a senior intelligence officer, an attire of quiet, serious authority. The event was a formal award ceremony at the Pentagon, and the announcer, his voice boomed through the hall, reading the official citation. He spoke in the sanitized, heroic language of government commendations, describing how a senior intelligence analyst's timely and decisive action preempted a hostile state-sponsored assassination attempt, saving numerous lives and preserving a critical diplomatic accord. It was a story with all the classified details stripped away, yet the truth of it shone through. The man who stepped forward to pin the Defense Distinguished Service Medal on my uniform was Colonel Davies himself. As he did, he leaned in and whispered, "The whole community owes you a debt, Director." From the stage, I looked out at the audience. My husband Mark was in the front row, his face beaming with a pride that was pure and uncomplicated. He wasn't the hero of this story, and he was more than okay with that. He was the proud spouse, and in his eyes, I saw my victory reflected. The room was filled with the leadership of the intelligence community, the directors and deputies, the legends of the trade. This was my real family, the one I had chosen, the one built not on obligation or birthright but on mutual trust and earned merit. My parents were there too, but they were seated far in the back, two small, distant figures in a crowd of giants. They looked irrelevant, as if they had accidentally wandered into a world they could never understand. After the ceremony, as I was speaking with a general about a new operational directive, my phone buzzed. It was a long, rambling text from my father. I saw a preview of the sentences, a clumsy mix of excuses about his generation, justifications for his pride in Mark, and a weak, belated apology buried somewhere in the middle. I read the first few lines, my expression calm, unreadable. There was no anger, no satisfaction, only a quiet sense of distance. I saw the words, but they no longer had the power to hurt or heal. The validation I had once craved from him felt like a currency from a foreign land, no longer valid here. With a simple tap of my thumb, I archived a conversation without replying. My focus was forward. The general was waiting for my answer. My father believed a legacy was about the name you were given. I learned that a true legacy is the one you earn when no one is watching, and have acknowledged in public. If you've ever had your quiet expertise mistaken for weakness, share your story in the comments. In this community, your signal will always be read loud and clear.